Now, with the general election just around the corner, people are understandably being inundated with a tidal wave of politicians, pundits and pickle-brained morons trying to throw their shade on the economic situation of the UK. And it doesn't feel like a partisan point to say that the UK economy is really struggling. So in this video, we're going to be going through who manages the economy better, Labour or the Conservatives. But our analysis is going to be better for four main reasons. The first thing is we're not going to look at very, very narrow time frames. We're going to be looking over a longer time period. That allows you to really look at the context and the trends. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to look at meaningful benchmarks and international comparisons. But this is maybe the most important one, which is we're going to be looking at multiple economic indicators. That's when you start to get a much better picture about what we're looking at. And the final thing is we're going to be looking at the two most recent periods that each of the respective parties were in power. So the first one is economic growth. And I think this is so often viewed as the Hard Rock Cafe of economic indicators, so it's the one we're going to start with. Now, when Labour took power in 1997 under Tony Blair, that period from 1997 to about 2008, including parts of the financial crisis, the economy grew by an average rate of 2.7%, which when compared internationally is like top tier growth rate. And that was ultimately driven by high levels of investment, capital expenditure generally increased. It's driven by better investment into public education. It's driven by a reduced level of poverty across the board almost, and it was just a really strong economy. It was kind of the roaring 90s. Now, obviously the financial crisis put a stop to that, but I think we should be very clear at this point that we should differentiate between economic hardship caused by economic policy and things that just happened. After the financial crisis, the economy clearly struggled, and what you ultimately find is that the growth rate of the economy from the 2010 period up until now has averaged 1.7%, and if you start to include some of the more recent quarters, it's even slower than that. So whilst it's fair to say that there were big economic disruptions under both sets of governments, it looks as though, for the most part, Labour have done a better job here. And there's plenty of evidence to back up the case that austerity wasn't necessarily going to be the best route. An IMF study in 2015 found that austerity was one of the key causes of the UK's slow economic recovery after the financial crisis. And a paper from the Resolution Foundation in 2019 found that austerity led to lower growth, it led to a reduction in living standards, and it led to wage stagnation, largely driven by a complete lack of investment. Next is unemployment. So when Labour came into power in 1997, unemployment was about 7.2%, and it hovered around 5% for most of the early 2000s, but obviously, as you can see here, unemployment did shoot up in the wake of the financial crisis. And this is one of the ones where the Tories have actually done quite well. So unemployment for most of the Conservative period has been around 4%, in some cases dipping below. It obviously increases over the coronavirus period, but that's to be expected. But for the most part, if you look at the averages outside, it does look as though the Tories have edged this one slightly. And I think this is why it's so important to look at multiple economic indicators. I think one of the things that you really need to look at is the security of people's work. So whilst the unemployment rate might have been lower under the Conservatives, which is obviously a good thing, if you look at, for example, the number of people who are in working poverty, so those people who have a full-time job but are still below the poverty line, that number has increased quite a lot, as we can see here. So it's not necessarily just looking at the number of people who are employed, but it's looking at what kind of jobs those people are doing. And this ultimately comes from the advent of things like 0 hours contracts. And this ultimately is why we're not just looking at a single variable, we're looking at a plethora of variables. Inflation. So for the most part, inflation stayed mostly under control during the Labour period, hovered around the 2%. There were occasions where it would kind of nip above slightly, but these were largely driven by demand pull factors. So these are instances where people have more money to spend, and so they go out and there's a bit of an overheating in the economy. And for the most part, inflation was under control. Now, for the Conservatives, the picture is obviously kind of different. In the post-COVID period, inflation has spiked quite dramatically. Now, plenty of you, understandably and to some degree justifiably, will be saying, well, the Conservatives can't necessarily help that the coronavirus pandemic screwed up supply chains and you had this slingshot effect where kind of white-collar workers were staying at home, had nothing to spend their money on. As soon as lockdowns get lifted, boom, they go out and they go spending crazy. And I think that's fair to some degree. So one of the important things that we need to include in this analysis, core inflation in the UK has remained higher when compared to international comparisons like the EU or like the US. And unfortunately, this is kind of driven by, we're here already, Brexit. for the most part, there's plenty of evidence. There's this piece here which basically finds that Brexit is a large driver of what we're seeing when it comes to the stickiness of inflation when compared internationally. We've got this paper here that finds a similar thing, that the border checks that are being implemented by the UK means that the additional red tape costs are getting passed from producers to consumers. So this is obviously a mixed bag at best. So whilst it is fair to say that the Conservatives had an inflation shock happen on their watch, which is fair, I think it's also fair to say they have also implemented policies which have pushed the resting level of inflation higher than it would otherwise have been, primarily through Brexit. Productivity. Now, again, under Labour in the 90s and the early 2000s, the UK had some of the best productivity growth in the whole of the G7. And this ultimately came down to investment in education. There was the famous Tony Blair thing, education, education, education. And it was just an area which he and Gordon Brown had really decided to invest heavily into. And the economy started to see the real gains from it. And this is really just one of the key areas that we talk about so much on this channel, that productivity, for the most part, has moved in lockstep with wages. So as workers become more productive and they're able to produce more in a given hour, in a given year, then the company that they work for can afford to pay them more. And so having these two variables work in lockstep to one another is beneficial to the employer as well as the employee. Under the Conservatives, it's been a very different story. Between 2009 and 2019, the UK had some of the worst productivity growth in the G7 after the financial crisis, but certainly, as you can see here, after the Brexit vote, investment in the UK just completely flatlined. And that's problematic because investment ultimately is one of the primary drivers of productivity. Not really much of a puzzle, to be honest. Investment completely flatlined and productivity flatlined along with it. And this point more broadly is backed up by this data from the ONS that basically found that the average in the 90s under the Labour government was about 2%, but from the financial crisis onwards under the Tories has been more like 0.3%. So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing wages just completely flatline. Income and earnings. Now, as you can see here, earnings under Labour did really quite well. That's largely driven by the fact that there was lots of public investment in education and capital expenditure, improving the overall productivity of the economy. And it's reflected in the numbers that you can see here. Real wage earnings increased pretty consistently year on year. But unfortunately, and this is to some degree the core of what it is we're talking about, real wages under the Conservatives have almost completely flatlined. And that's driven by a lot of what we've been talking about. And the last one is investment. Now, I've talked a lot about investment on this particular issue. And I think it's because I find this to be so frustrating because this is something that is very much within the government's control. They could just choose to invest more. And I think we should just address a kind of elephant in the room at this point, which is after the financial crisis, the UK was obviously, struggling money-wise, allegedly. But the truth of the matter is that the austerity programme was designed to cut public spending in order to balance the books, as they say, to make sure that we weren't living beyond our means. But the idea that you can treat an economy in the same way as you would treat your personal finances is just not really true for a whole host of reasons. But the obvious one is that you as an individual are very lucky that for the most part, your income and your expenses are independent of one another. Aside from maybe your commuting costs, you will get paid money almost irrespective of what you spend your money on, for the most part. But in an economy, it just doesn't work like that. If you stop funding HMRC, you don't collect tax receipts. If you stop putting on bus services, people can't get to work to go to their job to pay taxes. And so you have this much more rigid relationship between economic expenses and economic income. And so this idea that you can just cut spending and the economy will carry on moving is just completely not true. To conclude, is the Tories' poor economic record they inherited a bad economy? Sure, to some degree. Did the damage that COVID do to the economy hinder their possibilities and limit their options? Yeah, sure, there's some degree of that in there. But I think you reach one inescapable fact, which is from, let's say, 2010 up to about 2019, the Tories had basically about a decade of steady growth globally, strong relationships with trading partners. There was a lot going on. It was a time of reasonably good economic waves were about the place that you could ride. And the truth of the matter is the UK economy just went absolutely nowhere in that time period. And I think that is where the problem ultimately lies. So in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that under the last Labour government, they did do a better job of managing the economy. Bad things happened to them, obviously, and the Tories basically just adopted the wrong policy at the wrong time, and it was the wrong remedy. So ultimately, in conclusion, I think it's safe to say, based on the variables that we've looked at, and I did do quite a lot of research into this, it does seem as though Labour did do a better job of managing the economy than the Tories have.